Life inside ADX Florence, Colorado, no human contact. The most secure prison in the United States doesn't look dramatic from the outside. There are no medieval towers. No crumbling stone walls. No dramatic floodlights cutting through fog. Instead, it sits quietly in the high desert of southern Colorado, surrounded by scrub brush and mountains. Clean lines. Concrete. Geometry. But behind those reinforced walls is a place where silence becomes punishment. This is the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, better known as ADX Florence. Inside these walls, men can spend 23 hours a day alone. Sometimes for decades. No handshakes. No eye contact. No physical touch. And for some, no way out. What happens to a human being when contact disappears? And what kind of men are sent here when every other prison has failed? What happens next is even more isolating than most people imagine. The fortress in the desert. ADX Florence is part of the Federal Correctional Complex in Florence, Colorado. But unlike its neighboring facilities, this prison was designed for one purpose: absolute control. It opened in 1994 after a string of violent incidents in federal prisons. Officers had been killed. High-risk inmates were organizing from inside. Escape attempts were becoming more sophisticated. The federal government made a decision. If certain prisoners could not be controlled in normal maximum security prisons, they would be placed somewhere designed to remove every possible advantage. ADX was built as that answer. The architecture tells the story. Concrete poured thick. Windows narrow and angled so inmates can't see the horizon. Doors operated electronically from a control room. Movement choreographed like a machine. Every detail limits unpredictability. Inside are men convicted of terrorism, organized crime leadership, espionage, and murders committed inside other prisons. Some were gang shot callers who ordered killings from their cells. Others attacked staff repeatedly. ADX was meant to stop that. But stopping violence comes at a cost. And the cost is human contact. Who ends up here? ADX Florence houses some of the most notorious federal inmates in modern history. Ramzi Youssef, convicted for the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, responsible for the Boston Marathon bombing. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. And many others whose names rarely make headlines anymore. But ADX is not only for terrorists. Some inmates arrive because they were too violent for other prisons. They stabbed cellmates. Assaulted officers. Directed gangs from behind bars. Escaped from lower security facilities. In federal custody, if someone becomes uncontrollable, there is one final stop. ADX. But even within ADX, there are layers. Not everyone experiences the same degree of isolation. And what happens in the most restrictive units is something few people truly understand. The cell. An ADX cell measures roughly 7 by 12 feet. The bed is poured concrete. The desk is poured concrete. The stool is poured concrete. The sink dispenses cold water automatically. The toilet is stainless steel. Everything is built to prevent dismantling. The window is only 4 inches wide, positioned high and angled so the prisoner cannot see the surrounding mountains. Only sky. Even the view is controlled. The door is solid steel, with a small slot for food trays. Conversations with staff happen through that slot. There are no bars. You cannot see other inmates from your cell. You cannot shout across a hallway. Sound is swallowed by design. Inside that room, an inmate can spend years. Some spend decades. And for many, the most difficult part is not the space. It's the silence. The daily routine. Life inside ADX runs on schedule. At around 6 a.m., lights come on. Breakfast arrives through the slot in the door. No conversation. No gathering in a cafeteria. Meals are eaten alone. Most inmates spend 23 hours per day inside their cells. 1 hour is designated for recreation. But even recreation is solitary. When it's time to move, the inmate is handcuffed through the slot. Shackles applied. A correctional officer escorts him down a hallway lined with cameras. Recreation takes place in what many former inmates call a dog run. A small concrete enclosure with high walls and a metal grate above. Sometimes there's a pull-up bar. Often, nothing else. You are alone there too. Some inmates pace. Others stare at the sky. A few exercise intensely to keep their minds intact. After an hour, they return to the cell. The door closes. And the silence resumes. But that's only the visible routine. The psychological routine is more complicated. And more dangerous. The step-down program. Not every inmate stays in extreme isolation forever. ADX operates a step-down program. It is structured in phases. In theory, it allows prisoners to gradually earn more privileges and interaction by demonstrating compliance. In the most restrictive units, inmates are isolated nearly 24 hours a day. Communication is minimal. Movement is tightly controlled. If behavior improves over time, they may transition to slightly less restrictive units. Perhaps limited group recreation. Perhaps limited interaction during programs. But progress is slow. Months become years. One disciplinary infraction can reset everything. Imagine spending 3 years earning incremental privileges, only to lose them because of one argument, one rule violation, one act of defiance. Some inmates never progress. Others refuse to participate at all. And for those who remain in the most isolated units, the effects begin to show. Psychological impact. Human beings are wired for connection. Touch regulates stress. Conversation stimulates cognition. Eye contact grounds identity. At ADX, those elements disappear. Former inmates have described hallucinations. Heightened anxiety. Memory lapses. Depression so deep it distorts reality. Some begin talking to themselves. Others create elaborate routines to preserve sanity. Reciting books from memory. Counting steps repeatedly. Exercising in rigid patterns. There have been lawsuits alleging that prolonged solitary confinement worsens mental illness. The Bureau of Prisons maintains that ADX is necessary for safety and that mental health services are available. But consider the environment. A man alone in a concrete box for 23 hours a day. Year after year. What happens to time in a place like that? Days blur. Weeks vanish. The calendar loses meaning. And when isolation stretches beyond 5 years, beyond 10, beyond 20. Does the mind adapt? Or does it fracture? What happens next reveals how power is maintained inside a place built on silence. Control and compliance. At ADX, control is everything. Movement is controlled. Sound is controlled. Information is controlled. Correctional officers rarely need to raise their voices. The environment does the work for them. Every interaction is documented. Every behavior evaluated. Compliance earns minor privileges. Resistance earns restriction. Because inmates cannot physically gather, traditional prison power structures weaken. There are no large yards for gang meetings. No cafeteria tables for recruitment. Communication must be subtle. Sometimes coded letters. Sometimes messages relayed through attorneys. Sometimes shouted phrases timed with ventilation noise. But the structure of ADX makes coordination extremely difficult. That is intentional. The facility was designed to break organizational power. And in many cases, it has. Yet even in isolation, human systems find ways to survive. In the absence of physical hierarchy, psychological hierarchy emerges. Reputation still matters. And the stories carried by inmates into ADX follow them into their cells. The sound of nothing. One former inmate described ADX as the clean version of hell. There are no chaotic fights in hallways. No visible bloodshed. No riots. Instead, there is order. Extreme order. But that order is built on absence. No laughter in common areas. No arguments overheard through bars. No spontaneous interaction. Just the sound of ventilation systems and occasional footsteps. Silence becomes a presence. And in that silence, thoughts grow louder. For some, regret becomes overwhelming. For others, anger intensifies. Without distraction, the mind replays memories repeatedly. And when you cannot escape your own thoughts, what do? Some men begin to change. Others begin to unravel. But there's something even more unsettling. For certain inmates, ADX is not temporary. It is the final chapter of their lives. No release date. Many inmates at ADX are serving life sentences. No parole. No countdown to freedom. For them, the step-down program does not lead to release. It only leads to slightly less isolation. Imagine measuring progress not by years until freedom, but by whether you're allowed to speak to another inmate once a week. That becomes the milestone. And when the outside world forgets you, the prison becomes permanent. Family visits, when permitted, occur behind thick glass. Conversations through monitored phones. Physical contact never allowed. Children grow up. Parents die. Time moves forward outside. Inside, it stands still. And yet, even in a place designed for total separation, controversy has followed ADX. Because isolation at this level forces a difficult question. At what point does security become psychological harm? Lawsuits and scrutiny. Over the years, advocacy groups and former inmates have challenged the conditions at ADX. They argue that prolonged solitary confinement causes severe mental deterioration. That inmates with diagnosed mental illnesses should not be housed in extreme isolation. Some lawsuits led to settlements and reforms. The Bureau of Prisons created mental health step-down units and revised policies for screening inmates. Officials maintain that ADX remains necessary for the most dangerous offenders. And it is true that violence inside ADX is rare compared to other high-security prisons. But critics argue that violence is prevented by replacing it with something invisible. Total isolation. Is that trade-off justified? The answer depends on perspective. For correctional officers, ADX represents safety. A controlled environment where staff are far less likely to be assaulted. For inmates, it can feel like sensory deprivation stretched across years. Both realities exist simultaneously. And neither is simple. The officers. It's easy to focus entirely on inmates. But ADX also shapes the people who work there. Officers operate in a facility where interaction is minimal and constant vigilance is required. Communication is formal, procedural, measured. There are no casual conversations in cell blocks. Every movement involves protocol. The work can be isolating for staff as well. Unlike other prisons, there are fewer dynamic interactions. Less visible chaos. But the stakes are high. They supervise individuals who, in some cases, committed acts that changed history. And they do so within a system designed to remove unpredictability. The emotional toll of working in such an environment is rarely discussed publicly. But in a place built around silence, even staff absorb its weight. What isolation really means. When people hear no human contact, they imagine loneliness. But ADX is more precise than that. It is engineered separation. Meals alone. Exercise alone. Education through a slot in the door. Communication filtered. The design prevents not just violence, but influence. No hand signals. No whispered alliances. No physical intimidation. It is the removal of social leverage. For some inmates, that removal is exactly what prevents further harm. For others, it becomes a punishment beyond the sentence handed down in court. And here is the unsettling truth. Once someone is placed in ADX, leaving is difficult. Even after years of compliance. Because the label, most dangerous, is not easily erased. The longest stays. Some inmates have spent more than a decade inside ADX's most restrictive units. Imagine entering in your 30s and emerging in your 40s without ever shaking another person's hand. The outside world transforms. Technology evolves. Culture shifts. Inside, the walls remain unchanged. Re-entry into lower security prisons can be disorienting after prolonged isolation. Noise feels overwhelming. Crowds feel threatening. Isolation reshapes perception. And for those who will never leave federal custody, ADX becomes their permanent reality. But what happens when isolation is no longer just physical? What happens when it becomes internal? That may be the most profound impact of all. ADX Florence was built to solve a problem. Violence. Escape. Control. In many ways, it succeeded. Incidents inside are rare. Staff injuries are far lower than in other maximum security facilities. But success in security raises a deeper question. What is the cost of perfect control? Inside those concrete cells are men who committed serious crimes. Some caused unimaginable harm. Some led organizations that terrorized cities. Society decided they required the highest level of confinement. And ADX delivers that confinement with precision. Yet isolation on this scale changes people. It alters thought patterns. Distorts time. Redefines identity. When human contact disappears, something fundamental shifts. Whether that shift is justice, necessity, or something else entirely is still debated. The prison remains in the desert. Quiet. Ordered. Controlled. And inside, behind reinforced doors and angled windows, men sit alone with their thoughts. In a place where silence is policy. And human contact is a privilege few ever receive. The discipline unit. Even inside ADX, there are degrees of restriction. For inmates who break rules in an environment already defined by control, the response is swift. Disciplinary segregation within a Supermax prison sounds redundant. But it exists. Here, privileges shrink even further. Recreation time may be reduced. Access to reading materials limited. Personal property restricted. Communication tightly reviewed. Movement becomes even more infrequent. In a place built on silence, punishment often means deeper silence. Some infractions are minor, refusing orders, covering a camera lens, hoarding medication. Others are more serious, threats toward staff, attempts to pass messages, destruction of property. Because physical confrontation is rare inside ADX, resistance tends to take other forms. Non-compliance becomes symbolic power. But symbolic power is not tolerated for long. The system responds by tightening control. And the question becomes unavoidable: when you are already in near total isolation, what leverage do you have left? For some, the only thing left is endurance. For others, it's defiance. What happens next depends on the individual. Communication in a controlled world. Mail is lifeline and liability. Every letter entering or leaving ADX is screened. Names reviewed. Content examined. Suspicious language flagged. Because inmates cannot meet physically, written communication becomes currency. Some write daily journals. Others maintain contact with family through carefully structured letters that reveal little vulnerability. And some attempt to code messages. Even small phrases can trigger investigation. A seemingly harmless line may be interpreted as a signal. Telephone calls, when permitted, are monitored and limited. Visits occur behind thick glass partitions. There is no handshake goodbye. No embrace. A son might see his father through reinforced glass for an hour, then return to a world that continues moving. Meanwhile, the father returns to a concrete room where time stands still. But communication inside ADX isn't just about family. It's also about influence. And stopping influence is one of the prison's core objectives. Breaking organizational power. Before ADX existed, some inmates continued leading criminal enterprises from inside prison walls. Orders were sent through coded messages. Alliances were formed in exercise yards. ADX was designed to interrupt that chain. By eliminating shared space, it eliminates spontaneous strategy sessions. By controlling mail, it restricts coded communication. By isolating leaders from followers, it fractures command structures. For federal authorities, this was critical. Inmates tied to international terrorism, cartel leadership, and violent extremist groups required containment beyond bars and fences. But containment creates another reality. When influence outside disappears, identity inside becomes fragile. Who are you when no one can see you? When your reputation exists only in memory? Some inmates cling to ideology, writing manifestos that may never reach the public. Others withdraw inward, focusing only on daily survival. And survival inside ADX is not physical. It's psychological. Coping mechanisms. Survival inside ADX requires structure. Without routine, days dissolve into emptiness. Some inmates create rigid exercise schedules, thousands of push-ups per week, paced walking measured by counting tiles on the floor. Others read constantly. History. Philosophy. Religion. Law. Education programs are limited but available. Coursework arrives through the door slot. Completed assignments are collected the same way. There is no classroom discussion. No shared debate. Only solitary study. Some meditate for hours. Some pray. Some memorize entire books to maintain cognitive sharpness. Former inmates have described creating imaginary conversations just to simulate dialogue. The human brain seeks interaction. When it can't find it, it invents it. And that's where the line between adaptation and deterioration becomes thin. Mental health under isolation. The Bureau of Prisons states that mental health services are available at ADX. Psychologists conduct evaluations. Treatment plans are created. Inmates can request consultations. But therapy in a Supermax environment is unlike therapy anywhere else. Sessions often occur with restraints. Conversations through secure barriers. Trust shaped by surveillance. For inmates already diagnosed with mental illness before arriving, the environment can amplify symptoms. Anxiety deepens in silence. Paranoia intensifies without social grounding. Depression stretches longer without external stimulation. In past years, lawsuits alleged that mentally ill inmates were held in extreme isolation without adequate care. Reforms followed. Specialized units were developed for those with serious psychiatric needs. Yet critics argue that isolation itself complicates recovery. The paradox remains unresolved. How do you treat psychological instability in a place built on separation? And if someone becomes unstable because of that separation, what responsibility does the system bear? These questions linger in courtrooms and policy debates. Inside ADX, they linger in cells. Time as a weapon. In most prisons, time is counted down. At ADX, time stretches. Without social interaction, days lose markers. No conversations to remember. No shared meals to distinguish one day from another. Only repetition. Wake. Eat. Exercise. Read. Sleep. Repeat. For inmates serving life sentences, the repetition becomes permanent. For those with decades left, it becomes a horizon too distant to visualize. Some stop counting entirely. Others track every day with discipline, holding on to the idea that release from ADX, if not from prison, is possible. But even when transfer occurs, the psychological imprint remains. Former inmates have described difficulty adjusting to noise. Crowded dining halls. The unpredictability of shared space. Isolation rewires responses. Silence becomes comfort. Conversation becomes stress. That transformation may be the most lasting consequence of all. The rare moments of contact. Contact at ADX is carefully mediated. Attorneys may meet clients under strict security protocols. Visits occur behind glass. Voices travel through monitored lines. Family interactions are rare and regulated. For some inmates, years pass without seeing anyone they knew before incarceration. Letters become substitutes for presence. And sometimes, letters stop. When family members age or move on, communication fades. Isolation then becomes complete. There is no announcement when that happens. No ceremony marking the moment when outside connection ends. It simply disappears. And in a facility defined by separation, that disappearance can feel absolute. Staff perspective. For staff, ADX represents order in a profession often defined by unpredictability. Violence rates are low compared to other maximum security prisons. Incidents are rare. But the emotional landscape is different. There are no casual conversations with inmates. No opportunities for rapport building beyond structured interaction. The relationship is procedural. Commands given. Compliance observed. Documentation completed. Some officers describe the work as steady and controlled. Others acknowledge the psychological distance required to function daily in such an environment. Because when you supervise individuals who committed acts that shocked the nation, detachment becomes part of survival. The silence affects everyone. Not just those behind the door. Transfers and the illusion of escape. Very few inmates leave ADX quickly. Transfer requires sustained compliance, participation in programs, and consistent behavioral records. Even then, approval is not guaranteed. For some, it takes years. For others, it never happens. Release from ADX does not mean freedom. It often means transfer to another high-security federal prison. But compared to ADX, other facilities can feel chaotic. Shared cells. Open yards. Group meals. For someone conditioned to isolation, those environments can be overwhelming. In that sense, ADX changes more than daily routine. It changes tolerance for the world. And that effect lingers long after departure. The debate that never ends. Supporters argue that ADX prevents bloodshed. They point to reduced staff assaults. Contained extremist leaders. Disrupted gang command structures. Critics argue that extreme isolation crosses ethical boundaries. They question whether prolonged solitary confinement aligns with modern standards of human rights. Both sides rely on evidence. Both sides emphasize safety, but define it differently. Is safety measured by absence of violence? Or by preservation of mental stability? The debate continues in legal filings, academic research, and policy reforms. Meanwhile, ADX remains operational. Quiet. Unchanged in its core design. The human question. When ADX was built, it was intended as a solution. And in many measurable ways, it has been effective. But it also forces a deeper reflection. If prison is meant to punish and protect society, where is the line between necessary confinement and irreversible harm? Inside ADX, there are men who committed acts that altered lives forever. There are victims whose pain cannot be minimized. And there is a system that chose isolation as its ultimate tool. The desert outside remains silent. Mountains unchanged. Concrete walls standing firm. Inside, behind electronically controlled doors, human beings sit alone. Some reflecting. Some resisting. Some fading quietly into routine. The facility does not shout. It does not riot. It does not burn. It simply separates. And in that separation lies its power. Whether that power represents justice or something more complicated is a question that continues long after the door closes. ADX Florence was built to contain the uncontrollable. Concrete, steel, silence, engineered to eliminate chaos. Inside, some of the most dangerous men in America live without touch, without community, without the simple rhythm of human contact most of us take for granted. Whether that isolation represents justice, necessity, or something more troubling depends on where you stand. But one thing is undeniable. In the high desert of Colorado, there is a place where time barely moves, where voices rarely travel, and where silence is not accidental, it is policy. And behind those walls, the human mind is left alone with itself.